Hello, this is Faith of Faith and Books. How are you doing? I'm actually going to do a book review. I have been in such a reading slump. I've just can't finish anything, and I'm reading so slowly. I really think it's because of my eyes. I just don't take into account, just how slow I've become because my eyes are so bad, and I cannot read for very long before, I'm just squinting trying to read, and so anyway, so I did finish a book though. I feel like, what channel is that? Rainier Books? I've read something. I read this book, Consumed: Food for a Finite Planet by Sarah Elton, award-winning author of Locavore, which I would really be interested in reading. It took me a while to read this book. I thought I was going to whip through it. It's the type of book I normally would whip through, but I didn't. So it's on a topic that's already near and dear to my heart. And so she was preaching to the choir. But it's about our whole global food system and how unsustainable it is, basically, and how are we going to change it so that we don't have, so we aren't starving, or that we have enough food to feed people in the future, especially in light of shifting weather patterns and climate change and that sort of thing. So this was published in 2013. The first one is Target 2020, so we've already passed that one. And the first section of the book is on soil, because the thing about the global industrial food system, the agricultural system, is that it is based on these petroleum products that damage the soil. And so what you need to do is because the soil becomes less and less fertile, they have to put in more and more of these synthetic inputs, as they call it, like fertilizers, and then they use herbicides and insecticides and all that stuff. It's not sustainable. It's not the land wears out, and you become more and more dependent on these petroleum byproducts. And it also develops these huge areas of monocultures, which resiliency is found in biodiversity, but monocultures are inherently weak and fragile. And so by creating these vast monocultures of just one crop, it's like it makes it like a desert. And so it's very hard, if something goes wrong, it's very hard to recover. And so she goes into all that sort of thing, and the whole economics of it, and the whole global industrialization of food. It has been so bad for food production and biodiversity, and it's based basically on exploitation of land and exploitation of third world countries or developing countries. And what's really interesting about this book is she travels to different places. So she spent 2 years researching this book, and she traveled to India, she traveled to China, she traveled to France, and then many other places too. So I really liked the global perspective, because I'm used to hearing about this from the kind of, American perspective. And so it was neat. She's Canadian. So it was really interesting to get that global perspective on all these issues. And she tries to be balanced. Like when she gets into GMOs, she goes to a university in Canada which is like the center of them trying to develop a new type of rice that will be, more sustainable, I guess. And they're doing it through science. And so she gives that, she tries to be objective. But in the end, she comes down on the way humans have always survived, which is saving seeds and farming on land in a sustainable way. That's how people have been able to farm and farm and farm for, thousands of years on the same land, because they developed these systems that were sustainable. So, and she goes all into the whole GMO thing and the patents on seeds. And what happens is they're considered subsistence farmers, and they'll have been growing the same type of, say, rice for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And that rice will be very particular to that that valley or that area of, say, China. That's where her case study was. And then when the global people come in, they say, no, do it the better way, you'll make more money. And so they say, okay, use our rice, and it's this sort of standard rice instead of the one that's, particular to that area. It's a standard rice, but in order to grow it, you have to use these fertilizers, and you have to use these insecticides, and you have to use these herbicides. And so what happens is it seems like there's this promise of money because it seems like there's a big market for this rice. So they, they're kind of pushed. They're pushed by the government too to do this. They're pressured. So then they switch over, but they don't make any money because they have to buy all the inputs. They have to buy also everything that goes along with growing this particular seed or rice, and then they cannot save the seeds and then just plant them the next year because they're patented. They have to buy the seeds the next year too. So what looks really promising initially soon becomes it's like a Ponzi scheme or something, and they become very in debt. And then what happens is they become so in debt they wind up just leaving and going to the city where they're poor there. So, or they're really destitute. They cannot. So they're trying to reverse this, and focus on sustainable local cultures. So I learned a new word. It's called. It looks like the word terror, Terror, but it isn't. It's Terr. I think it's OIR. What's the French spelling? So it's terroir, and that is a term that comes from wine. So different wines. Hey, I'm drinking wine right now. This is from Napa Valley, I believe. This is, just as a side note, my husband's, one of his law partner's son bought a vineyard in California, and this is wine from that vineyard. Now I've lost my, terroir. And so people long acknowledged that there were different areas that grew different types of wine, and it was very distinctive. And people were really proud of the product that particular area produced. And that's terroir. But now they're like the Food and Agriculture Organization and World Health Organization, all these global organizations are recognizing that terroir exists in other things too. For instance, cheese, and it extends to other foods too. And terroir is about the interplay of the geography and the climate and the weather, and just the cultural practices around these things that produce this particular food. So she goes really into, she does a case study in France, where in the Aubrac region, they had a particular cheese that they were really proud of. No, it wasn't cheese. They produced a cheese, and then with that they made this signature dish of, it's kind of like really, really fancy mashed potatoes. And they used it with their local cheese. They made it with their local cheese, and it was this delicacy that they made. And so they wanted to preserve that. So there's this one guy who really became the champion. He's now elderly, but is still full of life. But he sort of led the charge to getting their milk, their cheese protected. So like you hear about seeds getting patented, and that's bad, but in the terroir situation, you don't want, I think she talks about camembert, that people just started saying things, or was it Roquefort? It was Roquefort cheese. People just started calling things Roquefort, but it wasn't coming from that particular area in France. And so you sort of want to be able to control the brand, right? So if you have this delicacy from your area of France that involves, the dairy practices and the way you make the cheese, and then the particular potatoes that you grow and how you actually cook it, and this creates this delicacy. you don't want other people copying it, right? Stealing it from you because it's inherent in your particular area, in your particular culture. And so in France, they have a way of getting certified where you're legally protected. And she really thinks that this is the thing to do because what happens is it makes it more profitable in the end to produce these things, and then you get these protections. And so one of the things is how do you, because we're dealing with age-old systems that worked for many, many generations that are sustainable. But these people are living at what we would see as subsistence level. So how do we make it so that we retain these sustainable practices and yet lift up out of poverty? And one of the things was that certification of the particular food that you grow. So farmers need a lot of support. So it was a very interesting book. I initially, when I first started reading it, I was put off initially because she talked about an experiment in Baltimore where this guy was growing, I forget now what it was. That was at the beginning of the book, which was weeks ago. But he was trying to figure out how climate affects growth. Or temperature rather. And so he had 3 different areas in Baltimore. One was on the harbor, so it was a little cooler. One was in another place where it was really hot. And one was in another place out in the suburbs where it was cooler because there were trees or something. And he planted the same things, and then he, drew conclusions. And one of the conclusions that he drew was that one thing with the temperatures increasing is that weeds can adapt faster than the crops that we grow, and because the crops we grow need a lot of inputs and support and that sort of thing. So the weeds would, just grow so incredibly fast it would really endanger our crops. We wouldn't be able to keep up with it. And later on in the book, she doesn't connect these two things, but she talks about GMO crops and how the GMO, whatever the gene is that they put in them, makes them resistant to glyphosate. How do you say it? Roundup. And I've been drinking the wine, so I can't pronounce glyphosate. Anyway, and so what they do is they, and that makes it easier to harvest because they just spray and the weeds all die. But because the GMO crop can withstand the Roundup, then they can just go in and harvest it, right? Which means that we eat this Roundup, right? That stuff is in the food we buy, in the flour and the corn and everything, but which is not good for human health. But what it does is it's like almost a perfect way to create an evolution of weeds that can resist Roundup. So there's a diminishing efficacy of Roundup because the weeds that do survive, reproduce, and then they are that much harder to eradicate using the Roundup. So she goes into all sorts of interesting stuff. I found it really interesting, and she gives a lot of hope. This was 2013. So that's almost 10 years ago. I would love to read something more up to date. I'd love to see if she's written anything since this, or if there's a way to keep up to date with this stuff. But she's a good writer. Oh, I know. I missed my point. What I was saying about the weeds is, but the weed in the Baltimore experiment, but the weed that she talks about growing really gigantically high, like this would be a terrible thing because then, we wouldn't have our crops, was lamb's quarter. And lamb's quarter is something people forage for because it's so nutritious. Like, it's something you can eat. And so I thought that was a terrible example to give because if we had huge lamb's quarter growing in our crops, we could all go out and eat it and it would be really healthy for us. So that, and there were a few things like that were like hit me a little bit funny, but most of all, I really enjoyed the book and found it really edifying. And I do wish I could read something more updated. And one thing, she ended with Detroit and how they have this culture now of urban agriculture, because Detroit went into the steep decline after the globalization of the auto industry, and everything moved out. And there were all these abandoned houses, and they went around burning them down because, I don't know why, because I guess gangs or something were living in them. And so they had all this abandoned property, so and there were no grocery stores. It was a complete food desert. The way Detroit is designed, it's really hard to get from one point to another. So it was this food desert. So people just started growing food. They just started their own vegetable gardens, and it became this thing. And it's sort of a renaissance of the city based on this urban agriculture that they've developed. So that was neat. One of the groups that was involved in that was called Earthworks. And it was a really neat title. It had a lot of depth to the title, because an earthwork is something that's military, that you build up an earthwork to defend yourself. And they were saying that they were, their earthworks was defending them from the environmental disasters that seems to be looming. But on the other hand, they're making the earth work for them. So it was a really neat explanation of why they called their group Earthworks. Anyway, I enjoyed this book very much. I recommend it, especially if you're interested in this topic, or even if you've never thought about about food security and about the very, ethically questionable food system that we have today. This would be a good book to read. And in fact, this weirdly tied in with my reading of City of God, because by Augustine of Hippo, because I'm at the part where he's talking about, he's talking about good and evil. How did evil come into the world? And he's talking about freedom, and that freedom, and this is a very Catholic thing, freedom is the freedom to do good. So the freedom to do bad is just having license. It's licentiousness. But the reason why we want freedom is so we can choose to do good. And I was reading this book, thinking about how hard, and thinking about the Plastic-Free July and how hard it is to avoid plastic. What I really don't like about the current culture is it is so hard to choose to do good, because all day long, you can be, because of our consumerism, we're so removed from the people who make the things that we buy. Like this shirt, I bought it in a thrift store, but I don't know who made it. It could have been slave labor, right? The dyes could have been really, really polluting. I don't know what went into making this shirt at all. It was cheap, and I was able to go in and, I got it at a thrift store. But somebody was just able to go in and buy it off a rack. And we don't care about how it was made or what people suffered for it, as long as we can just go into the store. And that's what we think freedom is. The freedom to just go shopping and pick up something if you like it. And is that freedom? Because I don't know. And of course, people have a conscience. And so you have more and more equal exchange and fair trade and all this stuff. But that's still on the fringe. By and far, most things are not ethical. And so you cannot get through a day without having some involvement with something deeply, offensive, right? If you're a person who believes in caring for other people in the earth, you cannot get through the day without being enmeshed, entrapped in this very unethical system that has deliberately separated us from the people who make the things that we need. So anyway, it was neat to have that little connection with City of God. So anyway, I've talked, oh my gosh, so long. I hope I can upload this. So cheers. I hope this wine was made ethically. I'm hoping, they probably put lots of chemicals and pesticides. Did you know wines are laden with pesticides? Anyway, let me put this down. And I think I'll just say goodbye. And I hope you're doing well, and happy reading. Bye.